Just moments ago, Vice President Kamala Harris addressed the powerful Hurricane Milton now bearing down on Florida's Gulf Coast, and also the dangerous disinformation we've been covering today that's being spread right now by Donald Trump about the government's relief efforts from Hurricane Helene. Listen to the Vice President's exchange with reporters on the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews just moments ago.
So I just got off the phone with Administrator Criswell at FEMA. And I cannot stress enough to all the folks in Florida, in the Tampa area, please listen to evacuation orders. Please listen to your local officials, because I know a lot of folks out there have survived these hurricanes before. This one is going to be very, very serious. And I urge you to please just grab whatever you need. Listen to the orders you're getting from your local officials. They know what they're telling you, and they know what Milton is about to be. So please do that. The other point I'd make is that there's a lot of mis and disinformation being pushed out there by the former president about what is available, in particular to the survivors of Helene. And first of all, it's extraordinarily irresponsible. It's about him. It's not about you. And the reality is that FEMA has so many resources that are available to folks who desperately need them now, and resources that are about helping people get back on their feet and rebuild and have places to go. You are entitled to these resources. People are entitled to these resources, and it is critically important that people apply for the help that is there to support. That all of those resources were created for just these kinds of moments in an emergency situation, knowing that folks are entitled to have the relief that they so rightly need at this moment in time. So listen to your sheriffs around the places that have been impacted by Helene. Listen to your local sheriff, who's going to tell you straight about what's available to you and how, for so many reasons and ways, there are no conditions attached to the relief that's available to you.
Vice President, Governor DeSantis, NBC is reporting Governor DeSantis is ignoring your calls on hurricanes, resources, and help. How does that hurt the situation here?
You know, moments of crisis, if nothing else, should really be the moment that anyone who calls themselves a leader says they're going to put politics aside and put the people first. People are in desperate need of support right now, and playing political games with this moment in these crisis situations, these are the height of emergency situations, is just utterly irresponsible, and it is selfish, and it is about political gamesmanship instead of doing the job that you took an oath to do, which is to put the people first.
Madam Vice President.
It was Vice President Kamala Harris, I believe, on her way to New York, fielding some questions from reporters about, putting it plain, quote, you are entitled to these resources. Listen to the sheriffs. I mean, she's dealing both with the disaster that Trump has made out of the efforts to respond to Hurricane Helene by making people distrust FEMA and people there to help them rebuild, as well as warning people now in the path of another deadly hurricane to listen to, as she just said, quote, listen to your sheriffs.
Right. I mean, it's so ridiculous that this man continues to shovel so much BS and to put people in danger in clear and undisputable ways. He's putting folks in danger. But what's interesting is that what he's saying is that he's putting forward a claim, Nicole, that enters into an ecosystem that automatically has distrust of the federal government. Right? Automatically has distrust of the federal government. So he's deepening that distrust in a moment in which the federal government is needed. And so it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. See, they don't support you when you need support. Republicans aren't funding it. I mean, there's a list of how many Republicans that did not fund FEMA or voted against FEMA not too long ago. And so this is entering into an ecosystem that actually deepens that sense of distrust. And Donald Trump's lying upon lying upon lying puts people in danger. And it just irks me as someone who grew up on the Gulf Coast, who's lived through hurricanes, who knows what this is about, who knows what awaits folk and what folk are actually going through now.
I can't imagine any family without power or having to evacuate and not wanting what, as she just said, You are entitled to this aid. This is your right as a citizen of this country to have access to aid in a case of a disaster. It is so much farther down the spiral than even I imagined that people who have been hurt, who have lost their homes or lost their businesses, are not accessing what they are, to quote the vice president, quote, entitled to, or listening to, quote, their sheriffs because they believe. I mean, it really gets into something else, not right, left, but some addiction to the lies and the liar.
Addiction to lies and the liar for the purpose of trying to tell people, as Eddie said, don't trust government, trust me.
Right.
This is from a person who's asking to lead government.
Right.
And saying, but
Backward.
don't trust it. It's backward, but this is the point about driving conspiracy theories for personal gain. And I mean, how many times in this country, which has never had a perfect union, never, but how many times in this country did we watch politicians put their differences aside in an emergency? Just say, we are not, in fact, even believing it was the kiss of death to be a politician who used human suffering to do anything other than unite or help or support, but to use it for division and to drive division. And the other thing, we were talking about being a patriot at the break when we weren't on television. And this point about where mis and disinformation is coming from in this election cycle, we should not forget we have been warned about the way we have foreign countries interested in driving division between us as Americans who are also utilizing social media platforms and creating mis and disinformation. It is even more incumbent upon someone asking to be a commander-in-chief of this country, as well as someone who is going to lead government, ensure that government is serving all its people, to be very cautious about where they're getting information, what they spread. So in every way, what was most interesting about what Kamala Harris said is, when she showed up on that tarmac, she showed up as a vice president. She actually, all her intermurps were not about the election. It was about her saying as a vice president, this is what you're entitled to. It shifts to politics because of what he has done, not because what she was doing.
Israeli-American Omer Nutra is 1 week away from spending his second straight birthday, his 23rd, not surrounded by his friends or family, but in Hamas captivity in Gaza. The New York native was taken hostage on October 7th while serving as a tank commander near Gaza. A day before, he made a typical call home to his parents. His mother told the Washington Post she remembered he sounded calm. One of Omer's friends, Hayden Roth, describes him as, quote, a big guy in stature with a big personality, someone who doesn't take himself too seriously. Remembering Omer's smile and laugh, Roth says he can't wait to see and hear those again. With me now, Omer's parents, Ronen and Orna Nutra. Thank you for coming today in particular. And Ronen, you've talked about, we were just talking about how Omer in Hebrew translate to first crop. He is your firstborn son. I read a lot about him this morning. I was amazed about many things, including the fact that he was captain of his high school soccer, basketball, and volleyball teams, a born leader.
That's right.
Tell us more about him.
Well, Omer is a combination of a goofy guy, a big guy that comes into the room and just welcomes everybody. And he has that leadership position that, or character that people are just gravitated toward him. And he's just, he takes leadership position everywhere he goes. He was the captain, as you said, of all 3 sports teams, but he was also a leader in his youth group. He was the regional president of the whole Metro New York. So a lot of kids know him and miss him and pray for him to come back.
Orna, every day, and I see both of you with it, of course, you wear that piece of masking tape, and now it says 1 year, marking the day that your son was taken. Your youngest son wrote, very movingly, in a piece that he penned, half your heart is held in captivity. How do you stay connected to hope?
We have no choice. You know, we pray that Omer is alive and he knows and he's counting on us. Just before he was taken captive, one of his very good friends shared with us after the fact that they spent some time and were discussing their plans for the future, and that Omer had shared with her, things about his family. And he said, if anything were to happen to me, then I know that my parents would do anything for me. And that's been our charge since this was 2 days before he was captured. So, we have no choice, and we must keep up hope. It's mandatory, as Rachel Goldberg, Hirsch's mom, said.
You have told me that you've spent half of your time on the road advocating for your son, for the hostages. 16 trips, Ronen, to Washington, D.C. What do you feel you can accomplish? Because I can only imagine that after a year, there must be days when you think, frankly, you're beating your head against the wall. The stress, the emotion of it, and yet you persist.
We're just normal people from Long Island, and all of a sudden you're thrown into one of the largest geopolitical crises of our lifetime, and especially in Israel. And we have a role. We know that when leaders see us and hear us, they have, or we can charge them with the mission here, and they know that they have to do something about it. And so we just want to keep being in front of them, push them, and we're looking for that strong leadership that will say, you know what, we are cutting a deal with the devil. Hamas is not a nice group. It's a terrorist group. But you gotta cut a deal with the devil in order to bring those 101 hostages, among them 7 Americans. And it's long overdue. We're 1 year in. We know they're dying. We just heard a month ago that 6 Americans, 6 hostages, among them 1 dear American for us, because we know his family so well. The Poland Albert was murdered, executed. Our kid, all those people over there, children, grandparents, men, they all have such a limited time, and it's so complex and so risky that we have to cut a deal.
Do you let yourself, Orna, imagine a reunion that he's released? And I wonder what you would even say to him.
I don't think we need words, We just need to be together. We just need to hold each other, and we'll be okay after that. It's been such a roller coaster of emotion, of hope and despair. And we are so craving a reunion. One thing we've heard a lot over the past year, unfortunately, is that one ingredient that's missing is political will. And that's very discouraging, If that's what we're missing, then that should be possible. And our leaders, like Ronen said, should be strong leaders and make the difficult decisions to bring them home. They are so missed. You mentioned his friends before. So many have reached out to us and shared things about Omer, parts of him that we weren't aware of. He's missed by so many.
I'm sure there are many people who are watching right now who wish there was something they can do, and perhaps that is your message. They can make phone calls. They can let their political leaders know that they want this, that they want your reunion for you. And after 1 year, it is extraordinary to watch the strength and resilience that you have on behalf of your son. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
But we begin tonight with the manic, bizarre, and frankly childish fanboying of Donald Trump, as illustrated by ultimate fanboy Elon Musk, literally jumping up and down on stage with Trump during a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. It was not just weird and meme-worthy, sparking hilarious online monikers like Dork MAGA and 2Live Coup, but also ominous, given some of the frankly alarming things Musk has been saying. But when you look at the people backing Trump, some of the most notable ones, I should say, are steeped in this precise moment.
I, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, do hereby swear to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa.
That moment in South Africa when Nelson Mandela became president, giving hope to people not just in South Africa, but around the world. An anti-apartheid activist and former political prisoner inaugurated as president of South Africa, just 4 years after the end of apartheid. But for Afrikaners, meaning South Africans of European descent, it was a moment of panic, an official end of racial segregation, a policy that benefited them and only them, despite them comprising less than 10% of the population, by separating the minority white population and designating areas and activities prohibited to the black indigenous Africans who comprised 80% of the population. All white enclaves flourished under segregation and anti-black government propaganda. Think Jim Crow America.
All I want is my churches must be white, my schools must be white, and my residence area should be white also.
And while some Afrikaners welcomed the end of apartheid, many others fled in fear of black power. It was known as the White Exodus. Some of MAGA's most significant backers were teenagers or very young adults when apartheid was eradicated. The Financial Times ticks them off. We have Elon Musk, who lived in South Africa until he was 17. David Sachs, the venture capitalist who left as a child and who has become a fundraiser for Donald Trump and a troll of Ukraine. Peter Thiel, an early Trump backer who spent years of his childhood in South Africa and Namibia, where his father was involved in uranium mining as part of the apartheid regime's drive to acquire nuclear weapons. And a lesser-known Paul Ferber, a South African software developer and tech journalist living near Johannesburg, who has been identified by 2 teams of forensic linguists as the originator of the QAnon conspiracy, an allegation Ferber denies. All of these men, their formative experiences in apartheid South Africa. Now, we in America are facing a moment when our politics are turning into their politics. MAGA is sounding more and more like the old Afrikaner parties, ranting about low birth rates, going after immigration and portraying immigrants of color as violent savages. The idea that democracy will end if their white male patriarch is not elected. They're going so far as to lie about the opposing party, about whether the Biden-Harris administration is actually helping people in a hurricane, or lying and claiming disaster relief funds are being diverted to help undocumented immigrants. Lies, lies, all lies. And let's not forget their overarching lie about climate change being a hoax. Even as Hurricane Milton strengthened from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in just over a day, part of a trend of rapidly intensifying storms fueled by the climate crisis. But instead of putting their energy toward helping those in need, these Republicans are looking to terrify people with racist, dehumanizing lies about Haitians or Venezuelans, and Trump's now thrown in people from the Congo. The point is to terrify white voters and vulnerable voters of color into running into the arms of the autocrat, Trump, the only one who can save them from the savages. It is the Afrikaning of American politics, which should alarm us greatly, given the brutality, fascism, and racism of the apartheid era, and how right-wing Afrikaners like Elon Musk may have been shaped by growing up and coming of age during the institutionalized oppression of black people and its abrupt, ignominious end. The Financial Times notes how Musk warned in 2023 about potential genocide of white people in South Africa. Trump's recent claim about American girls being raped and sodomized and murdered by savage criminal aliens preyed on similar white fears. It is far from a coincidence that this is happening as Democrats are fielding a black presidential candidate for the 3rd time in 5 elections, and why the leader of the Republicans is now an extremist known for enabling white supremacists and who is reviving race science as part of the discourse, as he did again in an interview today on conservative commentator Hugh Hewitt's podcast.
You know, now a murderer, I believe this, it's in their genes. And we got a lot of bad genes in our country right now.
And there you have it. Trump's long fascination with genes and bloodlines just got a lot creepier and Nazier with the claim that brown people have the murder gene. Joining me now is Adam Serwer, staff writer for The Atlantic, and Olivia Troy, former Homeland Security and counterterrorism advisor to Mike Pence and member of Republicans for Harris. Thank you both for being here. Adam, I do want to start with you because there is, I sort of read this, Financial Times piece, and I had this aha moment, because I wrote a book in which I interviewed a white South African professor, and he labeled this very thing, that you had the Afrikaner, right-wing Afrikaner Nationalist Party in 2012 warn American Republicans that if they didn't get a handle on it, then this country would be like South Africa. And he directly said Republicans need to turn themselves into an open white interests party. And voila, here comes Trump doing exactly that with a bunch of South African, Afrikaner, former South Africans at his back. What do you think?
I think that the race science subtext, I think that race science has been the subtext of a lot of Republican arguments. This idea, that Trump sort of almost made text in that Hugh Hewitt interview, that there is a natural genetic hierarchy of human beings with white people at the top and people who are not white at the bottom. And he didn't say, he came very close to saying that in that Hugh Hewitt interview. He didn't quite say it explicitly, but this is an idea that has grown more popular sort of in the undercurrent of conservative, what you might describe as conservative intellectualism. In terms of the books that they're reading, the ideas that they're toying with. And so it's not really surprising to see Trump express it. It's disturbing, but this has been percolating in right-wing circles for a while, unfortunately.
Yeah, let me just let him express it. Here he is. This is Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, talking about the enemy from within.
I always say there's an enemy from within, and there's an outside enemy. And if you're smart, the outside enemy is not going to be a problem. Russia, China, North Korea. We're not going to have a problem if you have a smart president. If you have not such a smart president, then it's a problem. But we have an enemy from within, which I think is much more dangerous than the outside enemy. We stand on the verge of the 4 greatest years in the history of our country.
And the not-so-smart president, of course, he's implying is Kamala Harris, because as he said before, she was born not smart, that he's got this race science view toward her, that she, the way he's saying it, the same way he talked about Barack Obama, that they cannot possibly be the leader of a country, they cannot possibly be intelligent. I mean, he's just saying it straight out, Olivia, and this is the policy position of the Republican Party. It's all about replacement theory and fear of brown and black migrants and them eating your pets. It's gone so far that you can't imagine it being a part of a Republican Party even 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I would say that this used to be the conspiracy mongering people on the far right that were sort of on the outskirts of the party, but they were never enabled to become the mainstream. And I would say now we've got the complete opposite, right? Now we've got the sane non-MAGA Republicans who are on the outskirts that have basically been kicked out of the party. And the conspiracies and the embracement of these white nationalists are now who are at the head of it, is what I would say. And look, this all speaks to the great replacement theory, right? The dangerous great replacement theory that leads to mass shootings and hate crimes that we've seen across our country. And that's why all of these words matter when you have someone like Donald Trump sitting there and Elon Musk, who has a very large presence in social media, circulating these narratives, including with the natural disaster relief. I mean, right? He's been out there sort of recirculating these posts that are dangerous for people who are actually in crisis, people in need, Americans who are just looking for help. They need the help right now. And all he's doing is undermining it. And I think it's all part of just the way they want to maintain power. Right? It's exclusion, it's fear, it's undermining of everyone but themselves, except for the people who want to be in full control.
Some unexpected stuff going on in some U.S. Senate races right now. I mean, first of all, just the fact that incumbent Republicans in both Florida and Texas, these safe red states, are facing actual honest-to-goodness fights to keep their seats. Ted Cruz in Texas and Rick Scott in Florida. Rick Scott in Florida is buying another $10 million of TV ads for the final weeks of the race, shelling out his own money. Then there's Pennsylvania, where the Republican Senate candidate this weekend decided to campaign outside a cheesesteak shop in North Philly. That event ended with the manager of the cheesesteak shop saying that Republican Dave McCormick is, quote, not welcome back. You're not welcome back. Then Dave McCormick crossed the street to a local Baptist church where the pastor there asked McCormick and his entourage to leave because he didn't, among other things, want photos of his church's members to be used by McCormick's campaign. The pastor said, quote, you can Photoshop. You can make things seem like they aren't. Maybe they're going to post we're eating dogs or cats like in Ohio. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I don't trust these people. So that went great for the Republican Senate candidate in Pennsylvania. Then there's Montana, where the Republican Senate candidate there is on tape repeatedly making really over-the-top, flagrantly racist, derogatory remarks about Montana's Native Americans, in a state where Native Americans make up fully 6% of the population. Republican candidate Tim Sheehy first tried to claim that the recordings had somehow been deceptively edited before he was forced to admit that they are real and not at all deceptively edited. He still refused to apologize for them, though. There's also the kind of unbelievable ongoing lack of a resolution over that same Republican candidate, Tim Sheehy, saying a bullet in his arm was from him shooting himself accidentally when he dropped a gun in a national park. But then he said the same gunshot wound was actually from him serving in Afghanistan. It can't be both. He's refused to release any information that would clarify either way, even as the disputed gunshot wound has been a huge part of his campaign, which just seems completely untenable as we get closer to Election Day. But yet, here we are. And oh, wait, there's more. If you were retiring from someplace cold, like Michigan, you could do worse than this $1.6 million estate in Cape Coral, Florida. You can see it has beautiful views. It has a very nice pool. This home, it's called an estate in its real estate listings. It was purchased just 2 years ago in the summer of 2022. It was purchased by Michigan Republican Congressman Mike Rogers. He served 7 terms in Congress. He spent 6 years in the Michigan State Senate before that, all before he decided to pitch it all in and retire to Florida to live in his dream house. I mean, between D.C. and Michigan, I guess, I don't know if you can blame him for wanting a taste of exceptional waterfront living in a much warmer location. The problem is, just 6 months after Mike Rogers bought his new dream home in Florida, an even more prime piece of real estate opened up. Michigan Democratic U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow announced that she was retiring from the U.S. Senate. And this new Florida resident, Mike Rogers, he really wanted to run for that Michigan U.S. Senate seat. But unfortunately, that would mean he'd have to move back to Michigan. Well, Mike Rogers decided he would buy this lovely little house in White Lake Township, Michigan. He bought it, then immediately knocked it down. This photo was taken by local reporter John King of the Michigan Advance on April 30th. It shows an empty plot of land where the house Mike Rogers bought used to be. This picture, I think, redefines exceptional waterfront living. 2 months after this picture was taken, Mike Rogers registered to vote using that property as his home address. Then 1 month after that, he voted for himself in the Republican primary for that U.S. Senate seat using that address as his voter registration location. Now, all this is turning out to be a problem for U.S. Senate candidate Mike Rogers. According to the Detroit Free Press, the house that Mike Rogers is still building on that spot isn't done. It, quote, did not, at the time he voted, and does not now, have a certificate of occupancy, which means Mike Rogers could not legally live there. Quote, and if he didn't live there, he may have broken the law by using that address to vote. Joining me now is ML Elric. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, currently a columnist for the Detroit Free Press. He broke this story in his column this week. He's also the host of ML's Soul of Detroit podcast. Mr. Elric, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
Did I misunderstand any of that, or did I pretty much get it the right way around?
No, I think the only misunderstanding, and the Rogers campaign won't help us out with it, is where does Mike Rogers actually lay his head? Michigan's residency laws are very loose. We're set up so that if you leave temporarily, if you go to college, if you become a veteran, or you're serving overseas, you can vote at your old address. The problem for Mike Rogers is we have no indication that he's ever actually lived at this address. And while they say you can't go home again, if you're never there in the first place, is it really your home?
He previously had said that he was registered at his brother's home in Michigan. And as I understand it from your reporting, you sort of spent some time hanging out around his brother's home, asking neighbors, asking people who lived in the area if they had ever seen him. It seems like, from your reporting at least, that his registration at his brother's home may also have been a bit of a ruse.
Yeah, I think anybody who's running for office, particularly in such a close race like this, doesn't spend a lot of nights at home. We're a big state. We have 83 counties, and you want to get to all of them. But you would think a former congressman who's living in your neighborhood will at least come by and say hi and say, can I get your vote? The fact that his neighbors have not seen him is pretty surprising to me. But the campaign assures us that at some point he really did stay there, which just means that he and his brother get along a lot better than me and my brother.
Both them and their spouses in a house with 1.5 bathrooms. Yeah. Let me ask you about one point. I'm just going to read to you from your column on this matter. There's still the question of whether Rogers committed a misdemeanor by using a home he could not occupy to register to vote, whether he committed a felony by voting in the August 6th primary, and whether he can even legally vote for himself in the November 5th election, right? You can't legally reside somewhere where there's no certificate of occupancy. If you don't legally reside somewhere, hard to say that you can register to vote there. Are Democrats, as political opponents, good government groups, watchdogs, anybody pursuing this as a legal matter involving Mr. Rogers and potentially his ability to even vote for himself, the question of whether or not he might have broken the law by doing so in the past?
Yeah, we just broke this story on Sunday, so I think the fallout is still kind of cascading through the Michigan political landscape. But frankly, given how Republicans are so worried about voter fraud and people voting illegally, if anybody's going to raise a red flag on this, I would think it would be the Republican Party. But then again, he is the Republican candidate. So maybe some other folks are going to say something. And unless he moves into that place before November 5th, there's always the chance that when he goes to vote, somebody's going to say, excuse me, I'm challenging this gentleman's right to cast a ballot, presumably for himself.
Wow. ML Elrick, columnist for the Detroit Free Press. Thank you for helping us understand this story. I appreciate your time.
Can we just look at this? 60 Minutes, Call Her Daddy podcast, Howard Stern, late night shows, The View. I interviewed VP Harris for 25 minutes a week and a half ago on the economy. Her campaign promised that she would be getting out. Here she is. What's the strategy?
Well, look, I think they feel like they have to mix it up a little bit, right? The rally stage, the summer of joy has kind of worked itself through. It's gotten as far as it can get. They need to mix it up again to try to see if they can't earn some more votes, right? And one way you do it is by, making the story fresh. They need to have fresh stories by doing interviews, by having conversations, by attracting voters who may only be turning in now to pay attention to the campaign. So I think that they've got a few weeks left. They've got 29 days to make the difference with these handful of people, really very small number of people they've got left. Interviews are one way to do it. Now, many of them are not as tough as you are. A lot of them are going to be, friendly interviewers. But a few like 60 Minutes and are legitimate journalists like MSNBC, like you, and like other interviewers she's going to have. She's mixing it up between those and the ones where she feels like she can have a little bit of, interactions with, right? That'll be more friendly and perhaps fun for the audience. But she has to answer tough questions. And I think that she wants to show she's not afraid of tough questions. And that's why she's doing some of these.
Let's just stick with that, Susan, because she was criticized for not doing interviews. Now she's criticized that the interviews are too friendly. The goalpost keeps moving for her. Are they going to stop? Is there something she could do to make them stop? Or is it really they're just goading her to do more and more, hoping more exposure will mean she'll slip up and have make a mistake?
Well, look, 29 days out of a too close to call election, of course, the other side is rooting for her to make a mistake and to screw up. But I'm struck by the fact, Stephanie, that there's no obvious kind of what the campaigns are calling tentpole moment left in this campaign, right? So one of the reasons that Harris has to go out and do all these interviews is because there is no more debates. Donald Trump has not accepted, she has accepted the proposal to do a third presidential debate this year, the second between the two of them. Trump is refusing to do that. After the vice presidential debate last week, there's no other obvious moment of sort of convening a massive audience. Their hope was that 60 Minutes as a very highly rated, if not the most highly rated news program, would be the opportunity to do that. Donald Trump backed out of his own 60 Minutes interview. So if you're looking for a contrast, obviously that's a pretty sharp contrast that Harris was willing to sit down with 60 Minutes and Donald Trump was not. They did have, by the way, a blistering introduction in which they pointed that fact out, and that Donald Trump not only refused to do the interview, but was lying to 60 Minutes itself about what he claimed they had done to him in their 2016 interview. A vintage moment, really.
60 Minutes brought the receipts. Let's talk about the comparison, Mark, because Trump canceled on 60 Minutes. He's refused to do another debate. I have asked him every single day since I sat down with VP Harris. I have asked the Trump campaign, would he sit down? Same rules, one topic, the economy. Let's do this. And he's not doing any of those things. He's going on Fox News and ultra-friendly podcasts to promote his campaign and his businesses. So Republicans, are they really in a position to criticize here?
No, of course not. And I think what this underscores is that Donald Trump is running a base campaign. I mean, base, I guess, has sort of a double meaning here, but base in terms of going after the supporters who have been with him for a long time. It doesn't look like he has a lot of room to grow or even cares that much. I mean, Kamala Harris, as the relatively new candidate in this race, or as the new candidate in this race, does have room to grow. And I do think, I mean, to Susan's point earlier, the work that 60 Minutes did really at the top, to me, I thought the takeaway moment from the 60 Minutes interview was the anchor at first. I guess it was Scott Pelley, not just sort of doing away with the cursory. We asked the Trump campaign to appear and then they said no, but they actually, like you said, I mean, they brought, they went the full 9 yards. I mean, it took a couple minutes, talked about the lies, sort of called Trump out, and it really did, I think, paint a very, very pointed picture, especially in contrast between the two candidates, but also when you consider the debate dynamic at this point. And, unfortunately, it doesn't look like they're going to be on the same stage again.
Peter, can we go back to this idea that she's being criticized, that she's only doing friendly interviews and people are on the attack going after Donald Trump? Isn't the difference that Donald Trump is giving journalists lie after lie after lie that we are in a position to fact check every single day? You can ask Kamala Harris a question and not like her answer and feel like she's speaking in platitudes and you're not up for that policy. But it's not about whether or not you like her policy. When it comes to Donald Trump, he's lying. Your reporting today talks about the clear decline he's in, the differences he shows as a candidate today versus than even a year ago or 2 years ago.
Yeah, it's really striking when they say that she's not willing to take questions, and they take questions and say, well, you're not allowed to fact check me. I'm allowed to say anything I want, no matter how true it is or not true, and you're not allowed to point out any contrary information or facts. You're right about that. I mean, I think that he is mainly stuck to friendly interviews, of course, himself. Conservative media, friendly media, not just friendly media, people who are openly on his side, who are participating in the campaign in some way or another. And I think that that's, of course, a contrast. But you're right to say that he, is called out on telling things that are not true, that are lies, that are false information, and it doesn't seem to actually be moving the needle. We did a fact check on him a couple of weeks back where we looked at a typical Trump rally. And we looked at a typical Harris rally. And we said, okay, what are the statements that were made in these two rallies could be called false or misleading? And his number was something like 63 in a single rally, and hers was like 6, so 10 times as much. So obviously you don't want to call it false equivalence. It's not that she doesn't say things, as any politician does, that aren't true or that are misleading, but the proportion here is obviously very striking. And it is, I think, something we see more and more. We could talk about the story about his age if you want, but I mean, clearly if you go back and watch his videos and you do any kind of analysis of how things have changed over the years, he is increasingly willing to say things that are not just untrue, but are so detached from reality, like the cats and dogs being eaten, and yet it doesn't seem to be rebound against him.
It's not our job to call out whether we like her policies or her answers. It's our job to call out lies. And you said it right there. What was it, 60-6? There's a difference. I also want to play just some of the lies that he spread just this weekend. Watch this.
Over the past 8 years, those who want to stop us from achieving this future have slandered me, impeached me, indicted me, tried to throw me off the ballot, and who knows, maybe even tried to kill me. They're going to cheat. They cheat. That's all they want to do is cheat. And when you see this, it's the only way they're going to win. And we can't let that happen, and we can't let it happen again.
Susan, it was Peter's words that he said much of what he's saying is increasingly angry and rambling. Donald Trump's age was never really called into question when he was running against Joe Biden. Certainly Joe Biden's was. Will it be more in focus now that he's running against Kamala Harris? That's not the Donald Trump we saw a couple of years ago.
No, I mean, let's be clear, first of all, that Trump, if he were elected, would be the oldest man ever to serve as president if he served the next 4 years, oldest ever to be elected as president, and take it well into his 80s at a moment in time when you can chart, as Peter has done in his reporting, as others have done, the very clear downward trajectory of Trump. This is very noticeable. Go back and look at him campaigning in 2016, and you will see a different person. One number that really stuck out to me in Peter's story was that the average length of time in a Trump rally has nearly doubled. It's over 80 minutes now. He's talking and talking and talking to the point of, does it seem like he's randomly rambling on? Yes, the answer is yes. This is in every possible way a man unwilling to relinquish the stage, literally relinquish the stage in his rallies, and of course, metaphorically as well.
I'm just going to keep reminding you, we are 29 days out until Election Day, so there's a lot to talk about. And with that, just about 4 years since Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. And still, so many Republicans can't bring themselves to answer a very straightforward question.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future.
Can you say definitively here and now that Donald Trump did lose the 2020 election?
Kristen, Joe Biden was elected president in 2020. It was an unfair election in many ways.
But did Trump lose? Did
Joe Biden was elected, Kristen.
Do you just not want to say that Trump lost?
Can you say unequivocally that Joe Biden won the 2020 election and Donald Trump lost?
See, this is the game that is always played by mainstream media with leading Republicans. It's a gotcha game. You want us to litigate things that happened 4 years ago when we're talking about the future.
It's not a gotcha question. It's a pretty easy one. Because these questions about 2020 are a clear test of how willing these Republicans will be to help Trump in his efforts to mess with this election. It's actually not a question about the past. It's very much a question about the future. And their answers kind of tell us everything we need to know. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman of New York. Congressman, it's great to see you. I have to start with what Mike Johnson just said. I mean, the question of whether Donald Trump lost is a gotcha game. That's what he said, which is obviously not a hard question. But I raise this because, to me, it's a reminder of what they're capable of doing another time around. But what do you say to that, and how did you hear it?
I heard it exactly as you did, Jen, which is that Mike Johnson, who is the architect of a brief filed in the Supreme Court by a number of House members, Republican House members, trying to overturn the election, it refuses to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the election. And why is that important? It's important because, first of all, it's a litmus test for Donald Trump as to whether or not he will, A, choose someone for vice president, which J.D. Vance clearly had to pass and must continue to pass. But also, Mike Johnson could be the Speaker of the House if the Republicans maintain the majority. He will control the gavel on January 6th. So it matters a lot what Mike Johnson thinks about the last election when 60 judges said there was no fraud. Bill Barr resigned because there was no fraud and he was getting pressured as Attorney General to say there was fraud. And it is unequivocal and unquestionable that Donald Trump lost. But they cannot say it. And what that means is that they will be happy to say the same big lie once again in 2024 if the opportunity presents itself. And we know that it will because Donald Trump is already saying that.
History repeats. It's important to be clear-eyed about it. Speaker Johnson also, I was just talking to Secretary Mayorkas about the hurricanes and hurricane recovery, and there's, of course, another one coming to the coast of Florida, expected to come to the coast of Florida. Speaker Johnson has said that despite the damage, Congress can wait to reconvene and vote on boosting federal disaster relief funding. He says it'll take some time to assess the damage. That part might be fair, but lawmakers now aren't scheduled to return to session until November 12th. I mean, are you concerned about? Can Congress wait?
I am concerned about it. We passed an additional $20 billion of funding for FEMA in the continuing resolution in September, and so there's some money for immediate needs. But what the Republicans refuse to acknowledge is that because of climate change, FEMA has 3 times as many devastating natural disasters as they had about 15 years ago. And so their funds need to be plussed up accordingly, and they're not because the Republicans refuse to do it. So the reason why FEMA doesn't have enough money in the Natural Disaster Relief Fund, which is, of course, entirely separate from the Shelter and Services Program, which is the one that reimburses localities for some of their immigration costs, predominantly in Republican states. But that's a totally different bucket of money, and FEMA doesn't have enough because the Republicans refuse to give enough, and now they're not allowing us to come back to make sure that the Americans suffering from Helene and potentially from Milton coming can actually get the help that they need.
It's really hard to understand, I think I'll say. I wanted to ask you, Congressman, you were...
Well, it's not that hard to understand when they have an election and they'll lie until they...
I agree. As I just said earlier, yes, you were less diplomatic in a good way. I wanted to ask you, Congressman, I mean, you were in Israel. Today's, of course, the anniversary of October 7th. You were in Israel with your family during Hamas's horrific attack. I still remember watching the interview you did with my colleague, Rachel Maddow, around that. 1,200 people were killed. More than 250 were taken hostage. How are you reflecting on that day 1 year later?
Well, I'm going to be honest. It's been a really hard day. Certainly flashbacks to what was going on with me in Tel Aviv as rockets were raining on down on us and my family and my 3 little kids. But it pales in comparison to just seeing hostage families as I have today, the Nutra family from Long Island, whose son Omer remains a hostage 1 year later. And just imagining the pain and the anguish and the fact that Israel, because there are 101 hostages who were illegally abducted and remain illegally in captivity in the dungeon tunnels of Gaza by a brutal terrorist group, Israel cannot move on until those hostages are home. And the frustrating part, of course, is not only that it's been a year since they were abducted, but that what we're seeing in New York City here and elsewhere is a rise in violent protest and calls for violence. People just outwardly waving Hamas and Hezbollah flags, supporting terrorist groups funded by Iran who not only want to erase Israel and all Jews, but chant death to America. And yet that is just growing here in our own country. And I think that every American needs to take stock of what's going on and what this fight is really about, because it truly is democracy versus terrorism and tyranny. And it is much bigger than Israel and Hamas, although Hamas needs to be eradicated, just like all of the other 6 Iranian-backed militias and terrorist groups who are attacking Israel and surrounding them. So it's been a very emotional day. I was in Central Park for a really moving ceremony, a commemoration with some excellent speakers and videos. And it just breaks your heart to see the families of these victims, the families of these hostages who were so brutally murdered in an unprovoked sneak attack on October 7th last year.
So much pain being felt by so many of these families, and obviously, of course, the tens of thousands of families, more than that, who have lost loved ones in Gaza in the years since. Congressman Dan Goldman, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you.